So welcome. Thank you for joining us today. This is our first offering from the Feminist Foreign Policy Project. And the goal of these is because we realized at Code Pink, as we work to end war and militarism in the belly of the beast, that we do a lot to try to end war, but that we'd really been missing in building up a movement that could be the groundwork for a feminist foreign policy. And so about a year ago, we decided to hold the space and support a space for this feminist foreign policy project. And over the last year, feminists who've been working toward a feminist world, a world of well-being, have come together to explore ways of how we could build this, because we want to build a community that can connect, educate, inspire, and activate, so that we can actually affect policy in the policies that create the violence and the super amount of money that is spent on weapons and war, and that really represents patriarchy and white supremacy and the destruction of the web of society and the planet, and create policies that can replace them, that build the world of peace that we long for. The thing that woke us up about why this was so needed is that when Trump was pushing for peace with North Korea, there were polls taken that showed, for the first time in US history, women polled against a peace treaty. That there were more than 50% of the women in the United States that said, no, peace with North Korea was not a good idea. And we just looked at ourselves and went, oh dear, we've got work to do. So we were reminded again last week at the DNC, which was very depressing, that there was no talk in the foreign policy section on diplomacy or peace or ways to diplomacy. Instead, what you heard was General Powell, a Republican who lied us into war with Iraq, where 1 million people are dead and millions are displaced, and Senator McCain of Bomb Iran fame. Or, also what was missing were the voices and the presence of Muslim, especially Muslim women, where, in this country, 2 of the members of Congress with the biggest backing, who won with the largest majority, are Muslim women, and they were both missing. So, and both are feminists in their foreign policy conversation. So I'm very excited to introduce you to my sister, my friend, the person just that I honor and celebrate, and just I'm so grateful she's on the planet. Shailja Patel, she's a Kenyan poet, a playwright, a theater artist, a political activist. Shailja all day and in so many forms brilliantly takes on imperialism, globalization, colonialism, migration, the status of women in the world, and the African and South Asian diasporas. She's best known for her book, Migritude, which is based on her one-woman show that exemplifies globalization as a people-centered phenomenon of migration and exchange. So she's also a founding member of Kenyans for Peace, Truth, and Justice, and a daily activist for a feminist foreign policy and a world of well-being and justice. Shailja, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. So I thought we'd start today, if you could help me, by reading what we all came together to write. That we came together, and the first thing was, who are we? If we come together, what can people know about what we're committed to working for? So if you could start with our mission statement, that would be great.
Yeah. The Feminist Foreign Policy Project was birthed through the shared labor of feminists from all around the world who are sick and tired of militarism, war, violence, and patriarchy. Our feminism has brought us to the same conclusions, that militarism and patriarchy are one and the same. We know that feminists, especially those in the global south, have the solutions that will allow us to build a world based off of equality, cooperation, and international solidarity, free of oppression and exploitation. Our vision didn't come out of nowhere. There's a long history of feminist resistance to imperialism, war, and neoliberalism. We couldn't do the work we're doing without the work of past feminists who showed us the way. The moment we're in shows us that militarism is worsening all of the major dilemmas we face. The global arms race triggers international tensions, exacerbates social inequalities, and intensifies racialized, gendered, and sexualized violence. Conflicts and wars displace vulnerable populations and lead to forced migration. They normalize patriarchal violence against vulnerable women, men, queer people, and children, and often intensify attacks on ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities. Bloated military spending and recruitment squanders the human and financial resources we need for life-affirming policies. Neoliberal economic policies bring so much harm to our environment and communities throughout the world. They bring levels of inequality that can't be allowed to continue. Extreme poverty correlates with higher rates of women forced into non-consensual sex work, left with no other option. We know that women, girls, and other oppressed groups suffer the brunt of the consequences of neoliberalism.
The United States and other imperial powers have a history of patriarchal military, trade, and aid policies. And it's still patriarchal, even if it's headed by women. They use foreign policy as a way to make corporations richer. They bribe, trick, and use technology to lure the hopeful and resort to overwhelming military force to punish those who resist. Humanitarian intervention is more often than not a mask for imperial control of other countries' resources. We know that we can create a future without coercion and without exploiting working people and our natural resources, because at the heart of our feminist agenda is an anti-capitalist critique. That's what will bring global justice. We want to build a worldwide movement for feminist foreign policies of peace and cooperation, but we also recognize the role of the US state in so many of the issues we're facing. So our primary focus is on US foreign policy. We have a radical vision of hope for our future, and we know that our future will be feminist when we take the lead of global social movements that use a feminist lens to connect capitalism, militarism, colonial expansion, and environmental destruction. So there you are with our mission, but Shailja, why don't you start out by defining feminism, since, as we know, that's a word that gets contorted so often. Why don't we start there?
It's really important that we define our feminism and recognize that there are many feminisms, and imperial feminism and carceral feminism and neoliberal feminism are very real things. And so we have to know what the feminism is that we're claiming. I start with the brilliant bell hooks, who defined feminism as an end to all relationships of domination. And if you really look deeply into that, that covers every sphere of human activity, from the economic to the political to the social to the familial. And Indigenous feminists have taught us that when we think about our relationships, we have to extend them to all species on the planet. We are in relationship to every aspect of nature. And that includes objects we think of as inanimate, rocks, the earth, air, sky, water. All of those are our relatives, and Indigenous people preserve those for millennia by living in relationship to them rather than trying to dominate them. once we have this definition of feminism, then we can begin to understand how to step back from the foreign policy of the US, which has always been about domination, first over this continent and then over every other continent on the planet.
Thank you. Very important to define things. So I want to say that the very first piece of this is how to define things, because the patriarchy and imperialism get away with things because they get to name what something is, which is totally a hypocrisy. And one of our main things is start in the naming, the describing, so that we can be able to peel apart what's actually happening. What, US foreign policy, what does it do in the world?
I have only learned in the last few years, and again from Indigenous feminists, Native American feminists, that US foreign policy begins with the conquest of the North American continent. It begins in 1492 with Columbus landing on this continent and launching 400 years of genocide and extractive capitalism. And what the US has done to Native nations on this continent is what it is now pursuing around the world, which is relentless extraction of resources, destruction of societies and environments in the pursuit of profit and domination.
Yes. Well, so yes, again, defining, and that's something that doesn't get defined and is whitewashed, avoided, and it's hard, always hard to stand on that and know that level of violence is what this life has allowed. And to, for us at Could Pink, it's a lot of the driving force of our work. How do we stop this hundreds of years of violence? And that's why I'm super excited to have the Feminist Foreign Policy Project. So why do we need a Feminist Foreign Policy Project, Shailja? What are some of the things in the world that we can identify? Thank you.
Well, you just point out the DMZ is an excellent example of where a feminist perspective and a perspective led by Korean feminists, led from the ground up by the women affected by the policies of the US, is so critically important. I want to turn the lens inward for a moment, because I think for so many in the US, the feeling is, well, yeah, we know the US does bad things to other countries, but as long as we're okay, we'll ignore it. But the reality is, right now, what we're seeing is climate crisis ramping up in extreme ways right here on the continent. California is burning, and we can trace that back directly to, first of all, the theft of land from indigenous nations who knew how to steward and manage those ecosystems and habitats, colliding with fossil fuel addiction, which drives global warming. The result is an inferno, and that's just a preview for the rest of the continent of what we're facing if we don't withdraw from our fossil fuel addiction and stop plundering and invading other countries around the world in pursuit of that. So understanding a feminist lens and a feminist perspective as a perspective of interconnection, realizing how to connect the dots between histories and every part of the world, and coming back again to our fundamental relationships with the land, with each other, with other human beings around the world, is so intensely important if we're going to save humanity, if we're going to save our species. Right now, 40 million Californians are wondering when the fire is going to come for them. In the rest of the country, we have a pandemic. 1,200 people a day are dying in the US, the highest rate of COVID-19 deaths across the world. And we can trace the US's colossal failure to control and contain this pandemic we can trace it directly to a testosterone-based foreign policy. Are you okay, Jodie? You look a little startled, alarmed. Did I just lose?
No, it's fine. It just, the sound got a little twerked right there, but you're on mute. You need to come off mute. Shailja, can you come off mute? There, great. Welcome back.
Sorry about that. I didn't know why my device is messing up. But okay, so I was talking about COVID-19 and the colossal failure of this administration to handle it in any sane way, which we can trace directly to a testosterone-based foreign policy. The Trump administration refused to follow or regard WHO guidelines. It refused to pay any attention to the information that China was giving to the world, or to consider the models that China and other countries were presenting to us for how to handle this in a way that could contain the spread of coronavirus and halt deaths and prevent transmission. So right there, we can see that Americans are dying. People on the US continent are dying in epic numbers and will continue to die because of patriarchal foreign policy. If we're looking at the rest of the world, women on the African continent are on the front lines of global warming. They are living with famine, with drought, with heat waves, with cyclones, with epic climate disasters caused by consumption in the global north. They didn't get to come to the party, but they're having to clean up the mess. And they have been talking, eco-feminists in the global south have been talking for a long time about climate justice, have been ringing the alarm bells for decades before climate justice was on the agenda in the global north. And one of the most important things we need to listen to is feminists in the global south telling us about the supply chains of so-called green technologies in the global north. So when solar power is touted as a clean green solution, there is going to be huge amounts of solar waste in a very short time from panels that are now obsolete. A lot of that waste is going to end up dumped in the African continent, as much electronic waste from the global north is. Just checking. The electric cars are being lithium batteries are being touted as another clean solution. That lithium is mined in countries in the global south in extractive and exploitative and incredibly damaging ways to local communities and local ecosystems. The US has just funded and mounted a coup in Bolivia in order to preserve its access to lithium. We had Elon Musk, one of the 10 wealthiest men on the planet, saying we will mount coups wherever we want to, literally declaring a US foreign policy that was completely about the interests of billionaires and about destroying countries that stand in the way and treating the rest of the world as a giant resource to be mined and then discarded.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you. So there's a question from the audience. They want to know what are your biggest feminist, anti-imperialist influences that you could recommend we learn from in building a feminist foreign policy?
There are too many to name, and I prefer that we begin to think as feminists, we really need to switch out of the idea of messianic leaders to understanding that it is movements that make a difference. The idea of leaders is also a patriarchal idea. It's this idea that we need one charismatic, powerful individual to tell us all what to do. Really, everything important that is happening in terms of feminist progress is based very strongly in movements. So I would encourage you, I'll talk about the African continent. 3 movements right there that you can learn from are the Green Belt movement in Kenya, The Nobel Prize was awarded to one of the founders of that movement, Professor Wangari Maathai, but it was really the movement that should have received the Nobel Prize. That's the problem with the Nobel Prize. The Abalali based in Jodolo in South Africa, who have fought this long battle against Australian mining companies who are trying to mine uranium from their pristine coastal ecosystem. And activists in West Africa who have been the Ogoni people who have been fighting for a long time against Shell, who have been drilling for oil on their lands and completely destroying their environment. So I encourage everyone to look to movements rather than leaders.
And we also need people like you who help us dissect it, because many of us aren't thinking about it all day. We need someone who does think about it all day to help dissect it for us so that we can find our way in and understand even what the walls look like. So are there any writers or thinkers that would help an audience to understand and dive in even to the question?
Okay, I would recommend the work of Thea Rio-Francos, that's Thea Riofrancos. She has done phenomenal work on the supply chain, the extractive supply chain of so-called green technologies. And she offers this very sharp and incredibly necessary critique of labeling technologies as clean when that cuts off where they're coming from and where we're disposing of them. I would recommend... go on.
Go ahead.
I would recommend Dipti Bhatnagar in Mozambique, who is a Greenpeace campaigner there. And she has talked and written a great deal about the impact of global warming on the African continent. That's just two to start with. I would also recommend there is a publication called Uneven Earth, and they have a great monthly mailing list where they send out a monthly reading list. That's an incredibly in-depth and well-resourced roundup of the best writing on climate justice, on environmental activism, on eco-movements around the world. It's a long and dense list, but if you really want a comprehensive base to start from and a really good range of resources, get on their mailing list.
So, and something I would just suggest for everyone is Feminism for the 99%. That team is part of the Feminist Foreign Policy, and it's a great, just on feminism itself, for the 99%, a great primer and a fast read, but kind of a, if you really want to like stand on something, that would be something I would suggest. The other thing is, if you're interested and you appreciated the mission statement, you can go to codepink.org/feminist and sign on if you agree with it. And then every 2 weeks, Katie sends out the best writing of the members, and which are all constantly dissecting the problem. And I think that's the other thing, is just like, once you have a grounding in really the simplicity, I want to say, of what a feminist foreign policy is, then you have like the tools to critique the world we live in, which is, rife with white supremacy, militarism. I mean, it helps you have that lens to your everyday, because we live inside a war economy, a very violent economy. And as Shailja said, built on genocide and racism. So the next question about what position would you see a feminist foreign policy taking in the use of violence in people's revolution? Is it nonviolent by definition? Does it stand against uprisings that use violence?
You want me to take that, Jodie, or do you want to go first?
You can start.
Okay. First of all, colonized people have the right to armed resistance. that right is enshrined in international law. So when the definition of non-violence has always been that the property of the ruling class does not get damaged, that the ruling class does not get killed or harmed, and that the structures that support the ruling classes or the dominant class, whatever it is, the colonizing class, remains intact. That's the definition of non-violence. So when we talk about non-violent movements, the people who are being non-violent are actually experiencing incredible violence on their bodies. In Gaza, for the last 3 months, people have been marching every single week to a fence, which keeps them in a state of the largest concentration camp in the world. And they are being shot by snipers. They are non-violent and they are dying, and nobody is paying any attention. So those people absolutely have the right to use whatever armed resistance they can. They have no access to arms, but they absolutely have the right to fight back against genocidal violence. And I'm absolutely in solidarity with any colonized people who take up armed struggle against their colonizers.
Thank you. I'm with you, and also just as someone from the global, a privileged person from the global north, I would never just take it upon myself to say what someone else could do or not do that is under the violent boot of the U.S. imperialism, hegemony, and colonialism. So I'm not going to comment, except I totally agree with Shailja. It's a horrible, horrible thing that we've done to people around the world. And I just look at people, I look at people inside and outside the United States and know that I would not have the patience that they do. I look at Gaza, I look at Cuba, I look at Iran and Venezuela and like the entire Latin America and Africa and Black people and people of color inside the United States. And I just, the capacity for patience and violence is profound, given what has been for decades, for centuries, befallen on beautiful and innocent people. So the next question is from Nima Babu, who's a foreign policy analyst and co-founder of X Relations, experience in policy development and international and domestic levels. And she wrote about the plight of Nigerian women in foreign policy. So she's offered a link that I'll put on our website, our Facebook, if people want to find it. Thank you, Nima, for being with us. Marcy asked a question about if green technology is extractive and harmful, what is the answer?
We have to figure that out. We know that people have survived on this planet for millions of years without destroying this planet. It is only in the last, 500 years of capitalism that we have seen more destruction of the planet than happened in the 5,000 years preceding it. So we have solutions. We have all the resources we need to actually live sustainably on this planet. We just need to be willing to embrace them, and we need to have people with the political will to implement them. And again, indigenous peoples can teach us that. They've lived here they lived on this continent for thousands of years before European settlers arrived here. And in 400 years, California is burning. California was not burning 2,000 years ago.
Or 500 years ago. So, I also want to say that, a lot of green technology is greenwashing. It's also part of capitalism, and it's just another way to make money. And that if, these solutions were taken in a whole way, in a regenerative way, I think if all the solutions had to, think about 7 generations, had to think about the health of the planet, had to think about the health of the people, and had to think about being in regeneration, we would make different decisions, because unfortunately, a lot of the green technology decisions are driven by greed. And, we see that over and over again. It's some of them, and people will argue, but the solution won't come up unless there's greed. And I totally disagree. All the great solutions come out of care and love and generosity, not greed and fear. So, one of the pieces of the feminist foreign policy is to really look at what are these decisions being made from. And we promised that we would keep this short. We're going to have many more. But, one of the examples right now is that both parties have decided that China is our enemy and are moving toward we're like in the middle, moving forward in a new Cold War. And, we look at these things, it's happening and I don't understand it. This is frightening, a new Cold War. These are global powers with nuclear weapons that we have not been able to stop. We have more nuclear warheads in the United States than we have hospitals. And the only thing that can happen in a Cold War is the escalation of nuclear weapons, which is bad in every way. That takes money away from the care of the people in both countries. That, destroys, economies. That destroys the planet. I just want everyone to know, a couple weekends ago, we were in the anniversary of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, where 200,000 people died. But what people don't know is that since then, 1 million people have died in the testing of nuclear weapons. So this is wrong. Right now, in the midst of a global pandemic, and as Shailja has pointed out, in layers, the effects of global climate change, we need to be working together. We're here together. They have both shown us we are on a planet together. And the only solution, the only thing that we can be doing right now is finding ways to be in solidarity, partnership, and collaboration. And so when you find yourself being driven to hate someone, you have to stop and know that you are being used by patriarchy and imperialism, neocolonialism, and hate. And you just can't agree to that. So let's just start, if you want to leave with, what can I do? That's one thing. And the next is that we also have a campaign called China is Not Our Enemy. And we're bringing voices from China so that we can be the bridges to peace. That can happen right now, because what we've learned in the last couple of months of this campaign is not only are the United States kind of not educated about China, but the whole world is, because it's Western colonial media that's kind of where we get our news. And if you go to codepink.org/China, we offer you lots of ways to be smarter. And I think one of the really important things of the Feminist Foreign Policy Project right now is just to make us all smarter. And I really want to appreciate Shailja for starting us off with the building blocks. What is the mission of this? What is it to be a feminist in a feminist foreign policy? And then what are the ways, what are the examples where we can see a violent patriarchal foreign policy play out in the world that we don't think about when we talk about that? So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Shailja, for being with us. Do you have any final words?
I want to just say quickly what you said about China and the impact of the Cold War. One thing to remember is the impact of the Cold War between the US and Russia on the rest of the world. Millions of small arms pumped into Afghanistan and the country destroyed, and the creation of the Taliban by the CIA and what they did to Afghani women. On the African continent, we had millions of small arms pumped into Somalia and Sudan during the Cold War by both Russia and the US, and the destruction of Somalia and the devastation of Somali society is a direct result of that. So Cold Wars use the rest of the world as their territory, and the African continent right now is already a battleground between the US and China for dominance, for rights over resources, for territory.
Thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us. Please sign up and there'll be much more. And thank you, Shailja, for all you do every day to make us smarter so we can be engaged better.
It's been so incredible to be here. If anyone wants to follow my work, Twitter is where I rant on a daily basis. My Twitter handle is @Shailja Patel, all one word.
Yeah, please follow her. It will make your days better. I promise you, it makes my days better. When I need to be in love, she brings me to love, and when I need to be railing, she takes me to the rail. So
no. Entirely neutral. You just define what you do for me. It's
all
so
right.
incredible to be here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Peace and love. Thank you.